In 1984, my brother disappeared in the woods of Crater Lake. No struggle, no note, just a torn strap from his backpack and the silence that followed. Years later, a ranger claimed he saw someone watching from the tree line, motionless, staring as if waiting. But by then, the disappearances had stopped, and the man they thought responsible was already dead. So the question that's haunted me ever since isn't what happened to Daniel. It's who was still out there after the killing ended. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name is Rachel Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and I've worked as a ranger in Crater Lake National Park for most of my adult life. Some folks fall into this job seasonal work summer gigs, but for me, it was always more than that. I grew up around these forests, knew the trailheads like the back of my hand. Before it all changed, my life was steady. Quiet in the way you hope for when you spend most of your days checking fire lines, issuing permits, clearing brush. I liked the rhythm. I liked the silence. I stayed close to the park even after my parents retired down south. Daniel, my younger brother, was supposed to come visit that summer. He was 17, all elbows and sarcasm, full of plans to hike the rim with me. But one morning, he signed out a trail register alone and never came back. I don't talk about it often. Most people just think he got lost. The terrain can be cruel out here, especially near the ravines where the paths thin out and the ground slides. That's what the official report says anyway, presumed lost to terrain. But there were things that didn't sit right. A hiker that same week swore she heard a boy calling for help near Bare Needle Hollow, a part of the park that had been closed off after a rock slide in the late 70s. Search teams went in, but they never found anything. Then in '87, a few years after Daniel vanished, a ranger named Don Weaver filed a report that got buried fast. He'd been stationed up at Windmere Lookout when he spotted someone, a man tall wearing a hooded coat, standing completely still near the old lava shelf. Just standing there, staring up at the tower. Don said the figure never moved, never flinched. He watched him through binoculars for 15 straight minutes until the fog rolled in and swallowed him whole. It was written off as heat shimmer, a trick of the light. Nothing followed up. But Don swore it wasn't his imagination. That's what brought me back. In September of 1997, almost 13 years after Daniel disappeared, I returned to Crater Lake on a full-time post. And the first thing I did before unpacking my gear before meeting the new district staff was pull Don Weaver's old weather log from the archive room. His entry from October 3rd, 1987 was still there. Coordinates, fog level description. And those coordinates, they lined up with other disappearance sites. Daniels, Susan, Allen, Aaron Daniels, all forming a crescent around one forgotten point, Bare Needle Hollow, a place no longer on maps, reclaimed by forest. That's when I asked Miles to come with me, just to check it out, see if there was anything left. That was September 19th, and by the 22nd, we'd find a cabin no one remembered, a notebook no one was meant to read, and something half buried in the ravine that would change everything. The trail to Bare Needle Hollow hadn't been maintained in over a decade, but Miles knew a firebreak path that cut around the ridge. It wasn't marked, and it didn't look like much, just a faint seam in the brush almost erased by years of pine needles and snowfall. But it was there, and we followed it. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. The forest shifted. Trees pressed in tighter, the ground grew uneven, and the temperature dropped. Not by much, maybe 5 or 10 degrees, but enough that I noticed. The birds had gone silent, and the usual underbrush sounds, the rustling of rabbits or chipmunks darting off trail, just stopped. We were 4 rangers in total, me, Miles, and 2 younger staffers from the East Post. Nobody spoke much. It wasn't superstition, just a kind of focus. When you're heading into ground the park doesn't monitor, there's no guarantee of what you'll find. About 3 miles in, we crested a narrow rise, and the landscape opened in a way that didn't feel natural, like the trees had been held back. Ahead of us was a steep drop into a gorge, narrow-shadowed, walled in on both sides by cliffs and thick stone. It looked like a bowl carved out by time, and it was hidden. Unless you were right above it, you'd never know it was there. Miles lifted his binoculars, scanning the slope below. "There," he said. "Past that split cedar. You see it?" I followed his hand. At first I didn't, but then the ivy shifted just enough. Underneath it, barely visible wood. Rotting, collapsed in places, but unmistakably shaped. We picked our way down slowly, the ground slick with old shale and moss. Branches snapped underfoot. The closer we got, the heavier the air seemed to become. The structure, what was left of it, sat against the gorge wall, half swallowed by vegetation. Beams, dark with rot logs cut by hand corners, lashed with rusted nails. Not a lean-to. A cabin. One that had been built, not stumbled upon. We moved carefully, not touching anything at first. I brushed aside a thick knot of ivy from what used to be the doorway. Beneath it, carved deep into the wood, were 2 letters. H and C. I stepped back and said it aloud. Howard Clemens. The others looked at me. Nobody argued. Inside, the roof had mostly given in. The walls leaned, corners sagged, but the outline was still there. Someone had lived here. Miles shifted a few planks aside in the far corner where the earth had sloped down behind a broken wall. Something caught his eye, a sliver of metal wedged beneath the floorboards. We dug it out carefully. A box. Sealed waterproof. Inside was a notebook, a small knife worn down to a sliver, and a photograph. A woman standing beside a truck, smiling in that stiff, sun-faded way old pictures do. On the back, in pencil, Margaret, 1952. The notebook's pages were brittle but readable. The handwriting slanted, precise. Not a journal. Not in the usual sense, just observations. Weather, foot traffic, descriptions of hikers. Saw another hiker. Tall, backpack blue, stayed out of sight. Camped near Ridge 3. Came too close. Waited until dawn to move. Page after page of this surveillance, maybe. Or just avoidance. A record of solitude, of watching from a distance. Near the back there was one entry that stopped me. The boy asked me my name. I said nothing. He stood still. He looked like he knew me. I turned away. I didn't say Daniel's name. I didn't need to. Miles met my eyes. Could be anyone, he said. But we both knew what we were thinking. We bagged the notebook and sealed the box. Just as we were about to leave, one of the younger rangers called out from the ravine. "Something else over here." We followed his voice a few yards east. He was kneeling by a slope of broken rock and pine litter, holding something in his hands. A torn scrap of fabric, orange, faded, bright enough to catch the eye. "That's pack fabric," Miles said. "Standard trail issue." I knelt beside it, brushing back the leaves. Beneath was the frame of a backpack, shattered, half-crushed. A few items had survived. A rusted compass, a cracked film canister, and a notebook soaked through but intact. I picked it up with both hands. I didn't have to open it. I knew. "It's his," I said. "It's Daniel's." Miles opened the canister carefully. Inside, rolled tight and dry despite the years, was undeveloped 35mm film. "We'll need the lab," he said. A second voice called from farther down. "Over here." This time the find was different. A low outcrop. Stones stacked deliberately. Beneath them bones, small, not human, arranged in a pattern. But beside them, wrapped in waxed cloth, was something else. A journal page, torn, handwritten. He told me he used to be someone else, said the world was too loud, that he came here to forget, but the memories still follow him through the trees. He said I was the first person he'd spoken to in years. He's afraid of what he's become. I read it twice. Daniel had spoken to him, whoever this was. He wrote it down. We pushed farther. The ravine deepened, the walls narrowed, and at the end of a winding bend we came to a small clearing barely the size of a single-room cabin. At the center was a mound. Shallow, disturbed. Something had once marked it, wood now rotted. We didn't speak. We just started to dig. It wasn't deep, 2 feet, maybe less. The soil gave way in chunks, and then we saw it. A wool coat, dark with decay. Bone. A skeleton curled inward from years of weight and time. Around the neck a rusted military dog tag. Miles wiped it clean with a gloved hand and read it aloud. Clemens, H. U.S. Army, 1944. I stepped back. My ears rang with the sound of silence. If Clemens died here, then someone else. Someone else buried him. Someone stayed. We turned toward the trees, both of us instinctively looking in the same direction the way back to the cabin. The wind didn't move. The shadows didn't shift. But the weight of the place had changed. Because now the question wasn't whether Daniel had met Clemens. It was who had taken his place, and how long he'd been watching. We radioed it in the next morning. The grave, the dog tag, the journal fragment, all of it. No one argued about the body's identity. The tag confirmed what we already knew. Howard Clemens had died out here. Likely in the mid-'80s, maybe earlier. But that only deepened the puzzle. Because the sightings, Don Weaver's report from 1987, the stacked stones, the presence that rangers had quietly mentioned over the years, they didn't stop after Clemens died. They began. That contradiction stayed with me. It kept circling my thoughts that night back at Ranger HQ. I sat in the archives room long after everyone else had left, thumbing through pages from Daniel's recovered notebook. Waterlogged, but still legible in places. His handwriting hadn't changed. I recognized it instantly. Short lines, sparse, no dates, just entries. He watched me from across the ridge again, said nothing. He knew I had a sister. I never told him. I read that line 3 times. The pressure in my chest didn't come from fear, it came from recognition. Daniel never talked much about me to strangers, not even when we were younger. If this man, whoever he was, knew I existed, it meant something else. I turned to another page. Not Clemens. Different eyes, younger. Stillness was different. That was all it said. But it hit like a dropped match in dry grass. It wasn't Clemens who watched Daniel, which meant someone else had been there. Someone who moved into that hollow after Clemens died, or maybe had always been nearby. I ran the park's incident logs again, this time focusing on the years before Daniel vanished. 1980 through 1984. Most were routine weather maintenance, a few backcountry injuries. But 2 caught my eye. Disappearances. Both solo hikers, both young men in their 20s. Both labeled presumed lost to terrain. One name stuck, Michael Lantry. A drifter listed with no fixed address. The last ranger to report contact with him, Howard Clemens. Logged in the margin of a weekly patrol chart. Gave water to hiker heading west of ridge. Warned about unstable ground. That was the only note. No follow-up. No known exit point. I called Miles at home. Told him what I'd found. "So you're thinking Clemens didn't take Daniel?" he asked. I let the silence speak. "You're thinking someone came after. Someone else picked up where he left off. Or someone who was already there," I said, watching both of them. We met again early the next morning and returned to Bare Needle Hollow. This time with more personnel, 5 rangers, 1 biologist, and a tech from the state team. The directive was simple. Widen the radius around the ravine. Document everything. It didn't take long to find more signs. Old traps cleverly concealed. A tarp shelter collapsed but still staked. And under a moss-covered rock, another sealed tin. Inside were bones, small animal cleaned and sorted by size. Mixed in with them were carved wooden tokens maybe 4 inches tall, crude human shapes whittled from pine and cedar, each bearing a slash across the face. Not damage. Intentional. I turned one over. Then another. 7 in total. Miles stood beside me, quiet. "This isn't about survival," he said. "It's something else." Moments later, a call came over the radio. North edge of the hollow. A ranger had located a stone circle. At its center, a single wooden post weathered, blackened in places. Attached to it was a strip of cloth. Faded orange. I didn't need to be told. I knew the color. It was the same as Daniel's pack. I walked up slowly. Miles followed. Carved into the post again and again were the initials D to W, some shallow, some deep, overlapping. "Erratic." He kept coming back. I said, almost under my breath. "This wasn't a one-time thing." Miles ran his fingers along the edge of the wood. "These cuts, this could be the same knife from the cabin." I opened my field notebook. Documented everything, every initial, every angle. Then I noticed something else. Mixed in with the letters were symbols. Not letters. Shapes. A spiral. A square. A human figure without a face. Childlike carvings. Miles stepped back and looked at the whole post. "This isn't a grave marker," he said. "It's a ritual." We called in Dr. Lyndon Ash, the park anthropologist. She arrived by mid-morning the next day. She'd worked with native petroglyphs and wilderness iconography across 3 states. When she studied the post, her tone shifted. "These aren't tribal," she said. "They're invented, created by someone alone, maybe for years. Synthetic but intentional." I asked her what they meant. She traced the spiral. Could be a loop. Repetition. Being trapped. The square might mean shelter. But the figure... She paused. "That one unsettles me. It's either the one being watched or the one watching." As the search perimeter expanded, another ranger uncovered something near a thorn thicket, a rough stone arch built by hand. Inside, a shallow pit. More bones arranged in pairs. Always one smaller, one larger. Always facing each other. I crouched beside them, staring. She was replacing people, I said quietly, or mimicking them. Miles nodded, and Daniel might have been the last one. That evening, I laid out the figurines from the tin one by one. 6 had the same rough form, same slashed face, but the 7th, it was different. Taller, smoother, no slash. I placed it at the end of the line. "What if this one's Daniel?" I asked. Miles didn't answer right away, but he didn't say no. That same night, the phone rang. The film from Daniel's camera had been developed. I picked up, listened, then turned to Miles. They found something, I said. A photo. One they didn't expect. His brow furrowed. Of Daniel, I shook my head. No. Someone else. In the background. Watching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because we both knew if Clemens was dead, then someone had stepped in. Someone younger. Someone who hadn't stopped. And whoever he was, he'd left his face behind. Just not where we expected to find it. The photo was taken near a fire. You could see the outline of Daniel's tent, the ring of stones, a small pot set off to one side. But it wasn't the campsite that mattered. It was what was caught behind it. Between 2 trees, almost hidden by brush, a figure. Not posed. Not part of the scene. Just there. Watching. Only part of the face was visible, one shoulder, a patchy beard, and a single eye reflecting the flash. But there was no mistaking the posture. Still deliberate, as if he'd been standing there for longer than just that moment. Elias the tech did what he could with contrast and resolution, zoomed in frame by frame, cleaned it up. Eventually a detail came through that hadn't been obvious before. a scar thin and diagonal across the right cheek. Rachel turned away from the screen and picked up the stack of incident reports again. Cross-referencing ranger citations with county arrest records from the early 80s didn't take long, not with the detail we had. Arrested in Jackson County, 1980. Michael Lantry, 26, vandalism, illegal camping. Charges dropped. The mugshot confirmed it. Scar across the cheek. Same general build. His record was short, just that one incident, but it gave us a timestamp. He was alive in Oregon in 1980, last seen headed toward the southern boundary of Crater Lake. No outbound record, no confirmed contact since. His name never made it into the federal missing persons database, and his disappearance had been chalked up to drifting. No one looked, but he'd stayed. I pulled Daniel's journal from the evidence shelf again and flipped to the line I'd read before. He told me he used to be someone else. The world was too loud. He came here to forget. If that was Michael, if he had stayed out there hiding or watching or something worse, then he may have followed Clemens, or found him. Or maybe he never found him at all. Maybe he just stepped into the space Clemens left behind. The same woods, the same silence. That afternoon, we went back to Bare Needle Hollow, retracing what we could from Daniel's campsite and the layout from the photograph. About 3 hours in, tucked just beyond a drop-off, we found another shelter. It was less structured than the cabin, but still intentional, camouflaged under pine branches and dirt. Inside were scattered tools, knife handles worn to the grain fishing line twisted into bundles, and a small wooden tray carved from split bark. But it was the far wall that stopped us, a tree trunk half hollow leaning into the bank. On the inside curve, carved carefully with the tip of a blade, were 2 sets of initials. DWW, ML, side by side. Rachel ran her fingers across them. He marked it, she said, like it meant something. Miles stepped back, or like he wanted someone to remember. That's when we heard it. Just a crack, a crunch, far off maybe 20 yards up the slope. But it wasn't wind, and it wasn't an animal. We froze. No voices, no radio chatter, just stillness. Then another sound. Not footsteps, a whistle, low, 3 notes, almost like a bird call, except it wasn't. It was human. Miles raised his voice steady but firm. "This is the Park Service. If you're in distress, we can help." Nothing answered, only the trees. Rachel looked up the slope. "He's watching," she said, not loud, not panicked, just certain. We followed the direction of the sound, slowly keeping to the trees. About a 1/4 mile in the trail narrowed into something different, less like a path and more like a corridor worn by repetition. It wasn't marked. It wasn't recent. But someone had moved through it many times. At the fork, we split. Rachel took the left, following a route down toward a dry creek bed. Miles took the upper path, circling the ridge. Radios stayed on volume low. Rachel moved slow light on her feet. There were no fresh branches broken, no sign of animals passing. Then just ahead in the soil, near a fallen log, a footprint. Bare. Deep. Still damp. The toes splayed slightly, the heels sunk firm. She crouched down but didn't touch it, just listened. Behind her the radio crackled once, then came Miles's voice, quiet and short. "Rachel, you need to see this." He was about 200 feet upslope near a moss-covered boulder. She climbed quickly. When she reached him, he didn't speak, just pointed. Under the edge of the boulder was a hollow, inside a ring of stones where a fire had once burned out. Next to it, a pile of notebooks, warped and bark-covered, but mostly dry. And behind them, etched into the inner stone wall, were faces. Dozens of them. All different. Some sharp, some blurred by time. Each one carved with deep care. But none of them had eyes. Just blank sockets. One after another. Over and over. and beneath them, a line repeated like a chant. "You forget the face, but it never forgets you." Rachel read it out loud, her voice low. Miles didn't speak. He was already flipping through one of the notebooks. Inside pages of dates, weather notations, ranger patrol names, trails logged. It wasn't rambling. It was organized, calculated. Then, near the middle of one book, a sketch, crude but clear. Daniel, sitting at a fire back to the viewer, his face turned slightly, his eyes scratched out with dark graphite. Miles set the notebook down carefully. He watched him, drew him. And then, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Rachel picked up another volume. This one had notes written lightly in the margins, almost invisible. She held the page under a flashlight. In charcoal, faint but deliberate, one phrase. "She's coming. She always comes." Rachel stood still. He knew I'd come back. They didn't camp that night. They hiked out straight to HQ, carrying the notebooks like they were holding something fragile and still alive. The tech team ran scans on the pages. Under infrared, more words emerged, notes written in smaller script spiraling down page edges and between lines. But it was the last page of the last journal that made them stop. 4 words, scrawled hard enough to tear the paper. I had to choose. That's how it ended. No signature, no name. Just the weight of that choice, whatever it was. The next morning, Rachel opened the drawer with Daniel's belongings and took out the figurine again, the one without the slash. She placed it beside the final journal and stared at both in silence. One stayed. One saw. And if those carvings were memory not warning, then the man in the woods hadn't just been following Daniel. He had been studying him, waiting for something. Maybe waiting for her. The following morning, I met Miles at the photographic analysis lab down in Medford. The technician, a soft-spoken man named Elias Harper, had been working on the film roll we'd pulled from Daniel's crushed backpack. The original strip was short only 6 usable frames. 5 of them were routine gear trail markers a squirrel captured mid-step. But the 6th, that one stopped us. Elias projected it onto a wide white screen, adjusting the focus until the grain tightened. The foreground was Daniel's campsite, cleared brush, a small fire ring, his tent pitched slightly off-center. But behind it, just past the tree line, a man, caught between 2 trunks. His outline blurred slightly by motion, as if he'd turned the instant the shutter clicked. All you could see was the upper part of his torso, the ragged edge of a beard, and one eye that reflected the flash like a cat's in headlights. We stood there in silence for a long time. "Can you bring the face forward?" Miles asked. Elias nodded, working the console. Bit by bit, the image sharpened. The shadows didn't give us much. No full facial view, no clear mouth or nose. But the diagonal scar on his right cheek showed up under contrast. Thin, but unmistakable. I noted it immediately in my field journal, marking the date and timestamp. "That's him," I said. Miles didn't argue. It was too clear. This wasn't a trick of light. This wasn't something Daniel imagined. Someone was there, watching. And Daniel either didn't know or he did and didn't want to say. Later that afternoon, back at Ranger headquarters, we pulled out every trail registry from 1981 to 1984. No sign of Michael Lantry's name. But then again, if he'd already stepped off the grid, he wouldn't have used the official routes. That evening, I sat with Daniel's journal again, combing over the pages one more time. Not just for entries, but for something else. Something less obvious. The margins. The spaces between lines. I used a UV filter. On the inside corner of the back cover in faded pencil, there was a name. Margaret. It was the same name on the photograph we found in the cabin box. the woman standing beside the truck. The year was 1952. It raised more questions than it answered. Was she someone Clemens knew before he vanished into the woods? Or someone Michael knew, someone he kept with him even in memory? I wasn't sure yet. But it was something. And when you're working cases like this, especially ones that go cold for over a decade, you learn to treat every pattern, every inconsistency as a thread. Pull enough of them and something will come loose. The next day we returned to the cabin site. Not the grave Clemens's resting place was still flagged off and monitored, but the original structure, the one built deep into the hollow long before the map stopped showing it. I brought a crowbar and a set of gloves. There were still sections of the floor that hadn't caved in completely, panels that sounded hollow when tapped. It took some time, but under the southeast corner we found what I was hoping for: a wax-wrapped bundle. Waterproof. Carefully placed. Inside was a single reel of audio tape. It wasn't labeled. We brought it back to HQ and had it digitized. The machine groaned a little, pulling it through. The sound was warped and static-heavy, but a voice came through. Male. Ragged. Slow. He keeps talking in his sleep. Keeps saying my name, but he never met me. He doesn't know I was watching. A pause, then a low breath like someone shifting their weight in the dark. Sometimes I wonder if he sees me. Not out there. In here. Inside the dark part of the fire. The tape clicked once and continued. I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand. But he ran. He ran into the trees, so I followed. Another crackle, then the voice again. They always run, and she always comes. That phrase again. The same one scratched into Daniel's notebook. The same one carved into the hollow walls. I didn't speak for a long time after we played it. Neither did Miles. We just sat there listening to the last few seconds of magnetic hiss before the tape wound to an end. The following evening, I returned to Windmere Lookout Tower alone. It was late, close to 7 p.m., and the sun was just starting to dip behind the rim. Crater Lake below was calm, almost too still, like glass poured into a basin. I stood at the same railing Don Weaver had stood at all those years ago when he claimed he saw someone watching from the lava shelf. I looked out across the tree line, scanning with my own field glasses. Nothing moved. But that didn't mean nothing was there. These woods, especially after sundown, seem to hold things longer than they should, sounds, shadows, breath. I took the figurine out of my jacket pocket, the one without the slash, the one I believed was meant to be Daniel, and I placed it carefully on the tower's edge, facing east toward the gorge. "You're not forgotten," I whispered. No one answered. But the wind shifted then, soft and cold, passing behind my ears like a breath. Not enough to move the trees, just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I stayed until the sky deepened from blue to slate, and then, just before I turned to go, something moved in the distance. Between two trunks, low and quick. It was gone before I could focus. But I didn't need to see it again. Some part of me had already known. We hadn't found the last piece of this story. Not yet. Because if that voice on the tape was right, if Daniel had run, then it meant he'd still had a choice. And someone out there had given it to him. Not with kindness, but with silence. The kind you don't come back from. I stayed at the tower longer than I meant to. The last train of sunlight had slipped behind the ridge and the chill came up fast after that. But I didn't move. I kept watching the tree line where I'd seen the figure shift quick low, gone in a blink. I didn't call it in. Not right away. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to name it. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that what I saw wasn't an illusion. And it wasn't wildlife. There was intention in it. Direction. That kind of movement only comes from someone who knows the forest so well they don't need to think about the next step. They just disappear. When I finally picked up my radio and said I'd be heading back down, Miles's voice came through the static almost instantly. He didn't ask what I'd seen, just told me he'd meet me halfway. I think we both understood there were things neither of us was ready to say out loud. Not yet. That night I didn't sleep much. The tape had been playing in my head on repeat, especially that last line. They always run. And she always comes. The timing of it, the phrasing, the way it echoed what Daniel had written in his journal, and what the carvings in the cave wall had said. That phrase had followed us like a thread across time, across different places, different media. And suddenly I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever recorded it had known I'd return. Maybe not by name, but by role, by pattern, that I would come. The next morning we went back into Bare Needle Hollow. Just me and Miles this time. We packed light, but we brought extra batteries and long-range radios. The plan wasn't to resurvey. It was to follow. We used the path Daniel had marked in his notes, the last known direction before he vanished. It wasn't official, and it wasn't easy to navigate. The terrain had shifted in the years since whole stretches swallowed by rockslide or overtaken by thicket. But the bones of it were still there. Old footprints long faded, trail markers carved faintly into bark, and something else, fresh impressions. A footpath worn down not by traffic, but by repetition. The soil packed tight in a narrow, unnatural line. We followed it without speaking. We knew we were somewhere that wasn't meant to be found. A little after noon, we reached a dry rise tucked between two shallow ravines. It wasn't marked on our topographic charts, but it was defensible partial visibility from three sides, good tree cover, a small natural spring nearby. And there, just under the roots of a collapsed fir, we found it. A second shelter, smaller than the others. Cruder, but more recent. You could still smell the smoke in the dirt. The fire ring was shallow, surrounded by flat stones arranged with care. Next to it, a short stack of notebooks, some protected by layers of bark and cloth, others barely holding together. And behind it, on the face of the slope, a vertical wall of carvings. Not initials, not symbols this time. Faces, dozens, hundreds. Some deeply etched, others barely more than sketches, all of them different, and all of them without eyes. Just smooth sockets, blank. As if the act of remembering had been stripped from them, as if the person carving them couldn't bear to leave the eyes in. Below the faces, a single line repeated across the stone, sometimes in neat script, sometimes as if clawed in with urgency. You forget the face, but it never forgets you. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Miles had already stepped back. There was something about the scale of it, the number of faces, the sheer density of memory turned inward that pressed against the air. It felt like standing in someone else's mind. We spent the next hour cataloging the scene. Each notebook, each carving, the fire ring, the structure of the shelter. But everything we found pointed in one direction. This wasn't a place for hiding. It was a place for returning. A record not of days or food or survival, but of faces. People seen, watched. Some known, some maybe imagined. In one of the journals, we found another sketch. Crude, but unmistakably Daniel again. This time he was standing, not sitting, holding something in his hands, maybe a camera, maybe a notebook of his own. The face had been erased completely, not just the eyes, scratched out so hard the paper had nearly torn. There was another note in the margins, faint, like the writer had gone over it more than once to dull it out. She's coming. She always comes. And just below that, something new. One stays. One sees. I circled that phrase in red pencil. For the first time, I felt like we were close to understanding what happened in 1984. Not just the event, but the decision. Because the journals weren't written with panic. There was no urgency, no fear, only reflection. Whatever Daniel had encountered, it hadn't taken him. It had waited, offered, and he had chosen. That idea rattled something in me. It wasn't what I'd expected. Not violence, not disappearance. Something quieter, something deeper. The kind of silence you step into not because you're lost, but because you're tired of being found. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, I walked a little farther up the slope toward the trees. There was a small outcrop there with a view of the gorge. On the edge of the stone was a flattened patch of moss shaped like someone had been sitting there, watching. I sat down next to it. For the first time, I let myself imagine what Daniel might have seen that day, the forest unfolding in every direction. No sound but the breeze, no motion but the shifting of branches. And behind him, somewhere unseen, someone recording it all. Not for a story, not for a crime, but for memory. A few minutes later, Miles called my name softly. I turned back. He was holding something up, another notebook smaller than the rest wrapped in wax cloth. It had been buried under a loose stone near the shelter's fire pit. Inside were only a few pages. But the final one held a drawing, an altar made of rock, a small leather-bound book resting on top, and next to it a photo. Not a sketch, a real photo of Daniel, older, alive, looking straight into the lens, and beneath it, in the same narrow handwriting as the rest, a sentence. He let me go, but I never left. We didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say, because whatever this was, it wasn't over. And if that altar existed, if the drawing wasn't just memory but a map, then someone had left it for me to find, not to explain things, but to guide me. And I was ready to follow. The path up the ridge was darker than I remembered, as if every step into the trees took me one layer further from the world I knew. I moved slowly, counting my breaths, feeling the hush settle in my bones. I didn't call for Miles this time. I didn't reach for my radio. I let the quiet guide me, tracing the trail I'd mapped in my head a dozen times, every root and rock familiar. Now every shadow a reminder of how far from safety I'd wandered. Somewhere out here was an altar, drawn in that last recovered notebook, a place marked only by memory. The ground turned soft pine needles piling up underfoot, the air thick with the green earthy weight of old rain. I found the clearing almost by accident. It was smaller than I'd imagined, ringed by stones that had been set there a long time ago, their sides mossy and sunken. At the center was a flat slab, more a table than a true altar, the kind of rock that looked ancient even under the weak sun. On it lay two things, a worn leather journal and a single photograph. The corners curled the surface faintly smudged, as if someone had touched it over and over. I picked up the photo first, holding it by the edges. It was Daniel, but not as I remembered him, not the boy in a high school jacket, not the grinning kid at the lake. He was older here, maybe 30, with a beard coming in and hair longer standing in front of a thicket of spruce, with his eyes just a little to the left of the lens. He looked tired, but he looked alive. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "He let me go, but I never left." My hands shook a little as I put it down. I opened the journal next. The pages were thin, crowded with small handwriting, no dates or names, just entries, thoughts, lists, fragments. Most of it was routine, almost meditative weather, animal tracks, movements in the trees, what the writer cooked for dinner. Then, near the end, the tone changed. She always comes. I told him the rules. He understood. I showed him where to watch, how to wait. One stays, one sees. She comes for the one who stays. I turned that over in my mind, the weight of it growing. I wasn't sure who wrote it. It could have been Daniel. It could have been Michael Lantry. Or it could have been someone else altogether. Someone who'd been here longer than either of them, who knew the patterns of solitude and return. Behind me, a branch snapped clean and sharp. I didn't startle. I just set the journal down and turned. A man stepped out from the edge of the clearing. Not young, not old. Hard to tell in the dusk, with a beard, long and tangled hair streaked with gray shoulders squared against the chill. He wore a coat I'd seen before, patched and faded, the same one caught in the old photograph by the fire. He kept his hands at his sides, fingers loose. His voice, when he spoke, was dry and cracked from disuse. "I didn't take him," he said. He stayed. I waited. The silence between us stretched and shifted, filled by the soft sound of wind and a distant bird calling once before falling quiet again. I asked, "Are you Michael Lantry?" He nodded just once. He wrote that, he said, nodding to the journal, after I told him everything. Told him what I asked. He looked away, eyes tracing the dark beyond the stone ring. "The world out there," he gestured with his chin, "it has rules, Noise. Out here you can let go of that, if you want to." He did. There was nothing aggressive in his stance, no hint of threat, just the slow, weary presence of a man who had lived alone for far too long. "Is Daniel still alive?" I asked. He looked past me toward the deep trees. He was, maybe still is, but not like before. "You let him go." He nodded again. He found quiet. I tried to picture it. Daniel, older, changed, moving through these woods the way Michael did. Silent, careful, impossible to trace. A man who had traded a world for a whisper. "You shouldn't look for him anymore," Michael said. His voice was almost kind, almost pleading. "Sometimes they don't want to be found." The light was falling away now, the edges of the clearing going gray and indistinct. I realized I had no more questions left, nothing that would force a revelation or bring the past back in any sharper focus. I gathered the journal and the photo and walked out, not looking back. The forest felt different behind me, emptier, but also somehow lighter, as if it had given up the last of its secrets for the night. When I reached the trailhead, Miles was waiting with the truck. He didn't say a word when he saw my face. He just nodded and held the passenger door open. We drove in silence, the engine hum steady and warm. I didn't sleep that night. I wrote in my own journal, copying the words I'd found. He let me go, but I never left. And I thought about how some people walk into the dark not to escape, but to finally belong to it. The next morning I placed the photo on my desk beside the figurine, with no mark, the one I still believed Daniel had carved himself. I stared at both for a long time, listening to the faint wind at the window, waiting for a sound that never quite arrived. There are mysteries that solve themselves in the light. And then there are the ones that keep moving in the woods, always just beyond what you're willing to see. I knew which kind we were dealing with now. When the sun finally broke through the blinds the next morning, I still hadn't slept. I sat at my kitchen table with the photograph of Daniel in front of me, the words on the back seeping deeper each time I read them. He let me go, but I never left. In the quiet, the phrase felt less like an answer and more like a lock, something final but unsatisfying. I kept thinking about Michael Lantry's voice in that clearing. His words, not a confession, not an accusation, but a statement of fact. I spent the day going through every piece of evidence again, every notebook, every tape, every item we'd collected from the woods. There was no real crime to prosecute, nothing to turn over to the sheriff that would lead to a formal charge. The only thing we had was truth, and even that felt as thin as fog over the lake at dawn. I called Miles and told him what happened in the clearing. He listened quietly, never interrupting, not even when I paused too long or lost my place. When I finished, there was only a long, steady breath on the other end. "So, what do we do?" he finally asked. I thought about that for a while. I think we leave it be, I said. Sometimes people make their own peace, even if the rest of us can't see it. He agreed. Neither of us wanted to be the person who tried to drag Daniel back into a life he'd already chosen to leave. There were no news articles, no press briefings, nothing that would satisfy the world outside. I wrote my report for the Park Service, careful to note only the verifiable facts, the discovery of Clemens's grave, the presence of old shelters, the journals and carvings, and the personal belongings recovered at Bare Needle Hollow. I made no mention of the clearing, or of Michael Lantry, or of the photograph of Daniel looking older, as if he'd grown up in another world entirely. The official story would be neat-tidy, and as incomplete as it needed to be. But off the record, I made a quiet pilgrimage. I went back to the fire tower where I'd stood so many nights looking out over the rim, the lake below, cold and unwavering. I carried two things in my jacket pocket, the figurine that hadn't been marked and the photograph from the altar. I placed them together on the railing, arranging them so they faced the woods, not the water. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind pull at my hair, the cold seeping up from the steel beneath my hands. Miles never asked me what I left there. Some mysteries, he said once, don't want to be solved. Sometimes the best you can do is honor the truth you're given and leave the rest to the dark. In the weeks that followed, I saw the park through different eyes. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow flickering through the pines, every hush at dusk took on new meaning. I stopped searching for Daniel in the faces of passing hikers and started hoping just a little that maybe somewhere out there he'd found the quiet he needed. The service called for an official conclusion, and I gave them one. I ended my investigation. I let the paperwork rest. I tried to let go. But some nights when the weather turns and the wind whips off the lake, I find myself driving back to Bare Needle Hollow. I park at the Trailhead Hike Inn and stand at the edge of that silent gorge, looking out over the emptiness where so many stories ended and began. I don't expect to find Daniel waiting, or Michael, or anyone else. The forest keeps its secrets, and now I think I understand why. For people like them, and for the pieces of myself I left behind, the silence isn't just absence, it's a choice. The last time I went, it was almost dark. The trees were packed tight, the hush as deep as water, the old stone circle half buried beneath pine needles. I placed my hand on the nearest rock, closed my eyes and listened. And far off, somewhere between memory and the present, I thought I heard it again, a three-note whistle soft as breath threading its way through the dusk. I smiled and turned back for home, the path behind me already lost to shadow. There would be no closure here, only the truth that sometimes letting go is the closest thing we get to justice, and some echoes never really fade. I think about Daniel most in the quiet after the world has turned in for the night, and the woods outside my window are nothing but a wall of darkness. Some days it's as if the whole case never moved at all, like everything we found the grave. The journals, the faces carved in stone belong to someone else's memory. But then, I'll hear that whistle in the distance, 3 notes drifting low through the pines, and I remember there are some stories that don't need answers to matter. Daniel chose his silence. Or maybe it chose him. Either way, I stopped chasing the question of why he left or what exactly he became out there. There's a peace in knowing he found a kind of belonging that made sense to him, even if it meant letting go of the world we once shared. For a long time, I carried guilt for not saving him, for not pushing harder when the trail went cold. But the truth is, we can't always hold on to the people we love, not when the wilderness inside them is deeper than the one outside. I know now that justice doesn't always look like handcuffs or headlines. Sometimes it's quieter, a kind of acceptance, a respect for the choices made by others, even when those choices break our hearts a little. Miles still checks in with me now and then. We talk about the park, the new rangers, the changing trails. He never asks for the whole story, and I never offer it. It's enough to know someone else remembers. And, as for Michael Lantry, I don't expect I'll see him again. He's part of the woods now, just another shadow moving between the trees, another secret held close by the land. I've kept the figurine and the photo on my windowsill. Some evenings I set a mug of coffee there beside them and watch the light change. In those moments, the ache of what's missing softens. I find comfort in the small rituals, walking the rim at sunrise, listening for that old whistle letting the forest remind me that every story leaves a mark, even the ones without clean endings. We all lose people. We all carry questions that can't be answered. But with time, the weight shifts, and what's left is memory quiet and enduring as the pines themselves. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred a memory or left you thinking about someone lost or found, I hope you'll share it or leave a comment below. Sometimes the only thing that brings us closer to understanding is knowing we aren't alone in the echoes. Thank you for listening, and for letting Daniel's name stay bright a little longer in the dark.